Welcome to this webinar from the Northern Branch of the Royal Society of Tasmania. My name's David Morris and I'm the Acting President of the branch. And we're broadcasting from Launceston, Tasmania. And we're delighted to welcome you all to this, our final lecture in the 2020 Launceston Lecture Series. This series of public lectures is generously supported by the City of Launceston's Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery. We invite participants in this webinar to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens to write your questions to our lecturer today. And we'll collate these, and we hope to have time to answer a selection of your questions during the seminar. Today, we're pleased to have Professor Henry Reynolds as our guest lecturer. Professor Reynolds is Honorary Research Professor, Aboriginal Studies, Global Cultures and Languages at the University of Tasmania. Henry Reynolds grew up and was educated in Tasmania in Hobart, at Hobart High School and the University of Tasmania with a Bachelor of Arts with honours and a Master of Arts. With his wife, Margaret, he spent several years teaching in London, returning to Australia in 1965 to take up a lectureship at the new Townsville University College, which is now known as the James Cook University. He spent most of his career in North Queensland, and he's best known for his many books, articles, and documentaries, notably about the relations between Aborigines and settlers. Professor Reynolds has published several articles about the Honourable Andrew Inglis Clark, who's the subject of today's lecture, including the entry on Clark in the Australian Dictionary of Biography. I'm delighted to invite Professor Reynolds to deliver his lecture, Patriotism and Place in 19th Century Tasmania. Professor Reynolds.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be speaking to you. And as you've already heard, it's a lecture about patriotism and place, in which will also include a reference to a very distinguished Tasmanian, Andrew Inglis Clark. But before I actually begin the more detailed, the details of the lecture, I just want to put it more in its time and place. Quite obviously, I'm talking about colonial Tasmania from about 1830 to the end of the 19th century. And I'm talking about the way in which the settlers, that is, the people who had arrived from England, either free or in many cases convict, of course, and the so-called native born, that is, the children, who grew up in Tasmania and were already a feature of the society as early as 1830, as we'll see. But it's also more generally about colonial societies of this kind, that is, settler societies, where Europeans moved to various parts in the world, particularly obviously Australia and New Zealand, but the Americas, both North and South. And they began the process of cutting their links with the old world and developing new ones with the country in which they lived in. That is the development of a local patriotism, a local sense of belonging. Now, my basic premise is that this happened very, very quickly in Tasmania, almost unusually so. To such an extent that Tasmanian experience seems to be quite different to the situation in the other parts of Australia. Because the conventional view is that it took a long time for the British settlers to come to terms with their new environment. It was a long time before they emotionally felt they were part of the new world. Now, this is a fairly common view, but in particular, I want to refer you to the comments of, quite recent comments, of one of our most distinguished historians, Geoffrey Blainey, who of course has written quite a bit about Tasmania. His first book was called The Peaks of Lyell, but he's also written a great deal about Australia generally. And he wrote a new book called The Story of the Australian People, which came out a few years ago. And he addressed specifically this question of coming to terms with the New World. So let me just quote. Australians have struggled to see their country as home. It took them generations to discover the content emotionally. The sense of overpowering space, the isolation, the warmth of summer, the garish light, the shiny leaf trees, the birds and insects, the smell of air filled with dust, the strange silences, and the landscapes in all their oddness had to become familiar. The physical mastering of Australia was swift and often dramatic, but the emotional conquest was slow. Australians did not love a sunburned country. They were still strangers in a new land. The land was only half won. Now that is probably a fairly common view. It certainly has been in the past. But I don't think that in any way is true of Tasmania. It's another example of the way in which Tasmania had a quite distinctive history, and we get it wrong if we try and impose patterns that are apparent elsewhere on the island experience. So let me move then to Tasmania in the early years of colonial settlement. And let me begin with the comments, or actually the speech, made by the chairman of what was the forerunner of the Royal Society. That is the Van Diemen's Land Society. The Van Diemen's Land Society, which was a scientific and cultural organisation, and its inaugural meeting was in 1830. And the chairman of the meeting was the Deputy Surveyor General George Franklin, and he spoke to the audience about this question of coming to terms with the new land. Let me just read you part of that speech. "We all remember," said he, "that melancholy day when, standing upon the poop of the good ship that danced beneath our feet, we strained our eyes to catch a last glimpse of our native land, and not less so the many succeeding hours which were occupied in looking over the bulwarks and recalling the many joys from which we were sailing away. Our hearts filled with these recollections when we thought it impossible that we could ever feel a permanent interest in any land but that of our early love." In other words, this is a classical statement of the early immigrant, feeling that they had lost their homeland. But Franklin goes on in quite a different frame of mind. "But these fears," he said, "were changed to hopes when we came and saw the richness and beauty of the country for which we had left our home. We found the soil productive of abundant harvests, the climate most congenial to our constitutions, the scenery magnificent and new, and the land altogether full of the most interesting curiosities. Who will deny that his sensations in making these discoveries were joyous, and at the same time preparatory to those of permanent interest in the place of this new residence? Such, I believe, are the feelings of all who hear me. And I propose to them a toast which they will joyfully pledge: prosperity to the land we live in." Now that's a very, very interesting comment, because it clearly suggests that Blainey's idea that it took a long time for people to come to terms with the New World simply didn't apply in Tasmania. Now, I think some of the reasons for this were intimated in Franklin's speech. Let's just consider a few of them. Firstly, he mentions the climate. Now, there's no doubt that the early writing about Tasmania, the books and the articles and the letters home, are full of praise for the Tasmanian climate. Now, that's partly because it was similar to Britain. It had many of the characteristics of the British climate, but it was also a much better, it was an enhanced Britain. Tasmania was much closer to the equator by about 1,000 kilometres than Northern Europe. And therefore it was lighter and warmer and much more congenial, as he said. But it still had many of the characteristics of seasons, occasional snow. Many of the English plants and trees flourished in Tasmania, and people felt a great deal of bonding with the climate. And they talked endlessly about the salubrious quality of the climate. And particularly visitors coming from India were just so delighted that here they had found a climate that was so much more congenial to their constitution than India. And they marvelled at the rosy-cheeked children, and they were delighted by the strawberries and the fruits of England and the roses and the geraniums. So here was another part of the world which had a climate which was congenial and similar, but if you like, better than the climate of their homeland. Now, Franklin also talked about the landscape. And there's no doubt that the early settlers, almost universally, felt a bond with the Tasmanian landscape. That is, they appreciated the rugged mountains, they appreciated the open countryside. And this, I think, needs some explaining also. Now, the people who arrived in Tasmania in the early years, and say the 1820s and the 1830s, were usually in middle age, but they had grown up in the late 18th century, when the early Romanticism was already changing British aesthetic appreciation. And this was the age of the picturesque, when quite quickly mountains and rugged landscapes became popular, and you began to have tourists going to the lake districts, and when they could, in gaps between the Napoleonic Wars, going to Switzerland to marvel at the mountains. Mountains now were part of the romantic landscape. Now, it's my view that the early settlers, the educated settlers who came to Tasmania, came with their eyes and their sensibilities prepared already to see Tasmania as beautiful and exciting and dramatic. But there was another aspect, and that is the countryside, the open countryside in particular between Hobart and Launceston and along the big river valleys, had been created over many, many generations by the Aborigines' use of fire. They had made an open landscape with scattered trees and grassland. This was not natural in the sense that it was God-given. It was a man-made landscape. But this too appealed to the British. It appealed economically because it was so easy to start farming. You didn't need to clear the trees. You didn't have to do all the labour in clearing the land. It was waiting for the plough. It was waiting for the flocks of sheep. But also, it had an uncanny look like the parks of the English aristocracy, which had been dramatically changed in the late 18th century, whereas people dug up their formal European, usually Italian gardens, and developed the romantic English garden, the gardens of Capability Brown. That is, with open grassland and strategically placed clumps of trees. In other words, Tasmania, the Tasmania of early settlement looked like an English gentleman's park, and they said that again and again. So these two aspects of the English aesthetic of the time, the wild landscapes of Turner and the settled landscape of Constable, could both be found in Tasmania. So that, I think, helps explain why the settlers arrived Quite obviously also that many of them got free land grants, they got cheap or free convict labour, and they had the country already prepared for their farming activities. But clearly they came to feel at home very, very quickly. Well, that's easy in a way to explain that these people had been prepared in advance to appreciate Tasmania. But what interests me even more is the young people, the native born, who had grown up in Tasmania. What were their feelings? Many of them probably had very little education. They could possibly sign their name, read a few words, but by and large, they didn't have much education. They certainly hadn't been schooled in the ideas of the picturesque. And we don't know a great deal about them because they usually didn't write anything. But there's one extremely interesting observation made by one of the colonial officials, a man called Boys, who was the colonial auditor, who wrote home to England in 1831 and left us with this extraordinary passage about the native-born children that he must have seen every day around Hobart. He says, "They are such beauties, you cannot imagine such a beautiful race as the rising generation in this colony. As they grow up, they think nothing of England and can't bear the idea of going there. It is extraordinary, the passionate love they have for the country of their birth. There is a degree of liberty here that you can hardly imagine on your side of the equator. The whole country round, mountains and valleys, rocks, glens, rivers and brooks, seem to be their own domain. They shoot, ride, fish, bathe, go bivouacking in the woods, hunt possum and kangaroos, catch and train parrots, wombats, kangaroo, rats, etc., etc." Now, this is a fascinating account partly because such accounts of the native-born children are so rare in Australia or in Tasmania or New South Wales. But here we've got a very perceptive man, an intelligent, perceptive man observing the native-born and deeply impressed by the love they have for their country. Now, this raises the question, is this something, did these ideas come basically from England, from Europe, or did they simply develop in the colony, that these people felt they belonged to the land and the land belonged to them? Now, this is something that interested me very, very much. And I remembered when I read this, a poem which had been part of one of my primary school reading books. It was a poem by the famous romantic novelist Sir Walter Scott, one of the great literary men of early 19th century Britain. And the extract that was in my reading book went something like this. "Breathes there a man with a soul so dead, who never to himself has said, 'This is my own, my native land'? Whose heart has never with him burned, as home his footsteps he hath turned, from wandering on a foreign strand? Land of the mountains and the flood, land of my sires, what mortal hand can e'er untie the filial band that knits me to my rugged strand?" Now, this is intriguing. This is Scott, the very sophisticated, elderly novelist talking about his ties to the romantic landscape of presumably the Highlands, saying in much more flowery prose the sort of things that it seemed the young Tasmanians were thinking and saying about their homeland. So let me just bring this first, if you like, this is Act 1. Let me just bring this together. I started by saying that any settler colonial society has a narrative of people arriving in the new land and gradually coming to terms with the new land, and eventually they or their children come to feel at home, rather than relating to the old homeland on the other side of the world. But that the view was in Australia that this took a long time. And as Blaney said, the Australians took at least several generations before they felt emotionally at home. Now, as I argued, this was not the case in Tasmania. This was not the case of the educated gentleman who set up the first scientific and cultural organisation. And interestingly, even more so, this was not the case with the native-born children living in Hobart who felt very much at home and spent their time wandering about the bush and feeling that this was the country that they belonged to. Let me move on though and see how these ideas developed. Let's move 20 years on for, if you like, Act 2. Now, by the 1852 that I want to refer to, the native-born children had grown up. That is the people that Boys was talking about. This was 20 years later, but there were many, many more of them. In fact, the population of Tasmania was made up of convicts, ex-convicts, native-born and free settlers, and the statistician at the time separated these groups, and the native-born represented 25% of the population. And they clearly saw themselves as a distinct group. They did not identify with Britain. They did not identify with the convicts and the emancipists, many of whom, of course, were their parents. But they felt quite distinctive, and it seems to me they mixed together, partly because this was the group that, not surprisingly, had an equal number of men and women, boys and girls, whereas the convict population, as many of you will know, was highly masculine, with far more men than women. And so this is one of the reasons I suspect that the native-born children stuck together. But at the time, in 1852, the great issue of the time, the overwhelmingly important issue, was transportation, the convict system. And the biggest social and political movement in the Australian colonies was centred in Tasmania, particularly in Launceston, where under the leadership of Reverend John West, the anti-transportation movement had become a very, very powerful force. Now, in 1852, as part of the an enormous amount of political activity, there was a night meeting of the native-born young men and women. At least 300 of them, because 300 we know signed a petition against transportation, and that both men and women signed the petition as native-born Tasmanians. And they made very powerful speeches, which combined their desire to end transportation with their frequent expression of their love for Tasmania. And at this moment, the Tasmanian patriotism had become politicised. The love of country was very much central to the idea that transportation must stop. That is, we had this beautiful country and it was polluted by the convicts sent from Britain. That Tasmania itself had this sense of freedom in the landscape, and that at times they talked as though they were willing, if necessary, to even take up arms to protect their country against the further importation of convicts. But there is one speech in particular that I found most interesting, and this is the speech that I will now refer you to. This was one of the young men, may have been one of the people that Boys had talked about, now a young man, maybe in his 30s. And he spoke to the audience of his fellow native-born Tasmanians, above all contrasting the purity of nature with the corruption of the society around them. And he had this to say about the landscape. Who, he said, can ascend our noble and romantic hills without being imbued with a sense of freedom? What reflecting mind can breathe the pure air of our mountains, of our mountain tops, without feeling a desire to accomplish the freedom of his native land, without bemoaning the dreadful state of penal thraldom under which we labour, without entertaining a wish to place this our country on an equality with our neighbours. Now that's, I think, a very, very interesting way in which Tasmanian patriotism was now almost precisely linked with love of country, love of the land, of the landscape, because the society was seen to be corrupt. The society was a society that no one could feel proud of because half the population were convicts or ex-convicts. Now they said, we don't feel any hostility to the convicts and the emancipists, because many of them had convict emancipist parents, but they can't have the same feeling that we have about our homeland, about Tasmania. Many of them would like to leave Tasmania. We can never leave because we belong here. Now, it's my view that these sentiments that I've just talked about were very, very popular. Now, we don't have public opinion, we don't have opinion polls in the 19th century, so how do we know this? One of the interesting things about the reports of meeting was that the reporters who were taking down the speeches, shorthand, also recorded the reaction of the audience. So you got, you know, in brackets, boos and hisses, you know, loud shouts, sit down, hear, hear, applause, loud applause. And in this case, and this was unusual because I've read the reports of many public meetings, after this young man had given this speech about the no-born romantic landscape and the freedom that it imbued in them, his speech was, well, actually this passage was followed by what the reporter called prolonged sensation. So these weren't just the views of one man, these were views that they obviously all felt was so important to their cause, that is the cause of Tasmania and the cause of bringing an end to transportation. So that's Act 2. The first, remember, the early first settlers, the free settlers, the young native born in 1832, we've moved ahead to 1852. We now move forward right up to the end of the 19th century and to the career of Andrew Inglis Clark. So let me say a little bit about Clark before I look at where he fits in with the story. Now, Clark was 4 years old when that meeting was being held, but his parents, who were Scottish immigrants, his father was an engineer with an engineering business, they were very, very strong advocates of the Anti-Transportation League. So Clark grew up with a background of opposition to the transportation of convicts. Living in Hobart, he was acutely aware of the convict heritage. He was, as he became a great Democrat, deeply concerned about the inequality and almost the caste nature of Tasmanian society in the second half of the 19th century. Anyway, he had a good education in the Hobart High School, as it then was on the Domain. He trained first as an engineer and then took up the law and started a very long career in the law. He went into politics, was there briefly in the 1870s, but then came back into Parliament in the middle of the 1880s, and for a long time in the 80s and 90s was the Attorney General in 2 administrations. So that's the general background of Clark's career. But we need to say a couple of other things about him. He is well known, I think probably among many people, as one of the perhaps the principal drafter of the Australian Constitution. He went to the first Federal Convention in 1891 with a draft constitution. He was also a great reforming Attorney General, carried through many, many legal reforms. He was a believer in human rights. He endeavoured unsuccessfully to have a clause about human rights, political rights embodied in the Constitution. And in some ways, the thing he's perhaps best known for was the introduction of proportional representation for elections in Hobart in 1896. Now, proportional representation was a new and quite revolutionary idea. And this was the first time anywhere in the English-speaking world that proportional representation was introduced. Clark modified the ideas of the English reformer Thomas Hare, and hence the Hare-Clark system, which was adopted eventually for the whole state in 1909. But this was a reform of almost global importance, because some form of proportional representation is used all over the world. And Clark, in so many ways, was the most important pioneer of this electoral reform. And significantly for Clark, it was a system which gave every vote the same weight. This was his attempt to get rid of the convict legacy. But where does Clark fit in with my story about landscape? Well, Clark, as a young man, was moved by two contemporary developments. One was the American Civil War, and he and his family were very strong supporters of Lincoln. And the other was the contemporaneous romantic bringing about of the unity of Italy, the Risorgimento. And he worshipped the great figures of that mid-19th century romantic movement, Garibaldi the warrior and Mazzini the prophet of nationalism. And Clark became a devotee of Mazzini, as he was also of American institutions and jurisprudence. So he like the early native born, he didn't think that much of England. He related much more to America and to Boston than to London, much more to American jurisprudence than to English law. But he also took his ideas about patriotism, both from the people among whom he grew up, that we've already referred to, but also to the ideas of Mazzini. Well, where do they fit into this? Well, Mazzini, above all, believed that it was geography. It was geography which determined the patriotism of people, because the world itself had been created by the Almighty with enormous diversity. And therefore it was expected that this diverse world would create diverse cultures and traditions. And that empire was in a way running against the will of the Almighty, because the world was diverse and yet empires trying to crush this diversity. And therefore it was overwhelmingly important that a country related to its geography, that its patriotism grew out of its geography. Now, this was clearly extremely important for Clark. On one of his journeys to Europe, he got off the ship, especially in Genoa, and made a patronage to Mazzini's grave and wrote a very, very moving poem about his devotion to Mazzini's ideas. So brought to Australia, or brought to Tasmania, what Clark was developing was the idea that Australian nationalism, or in particular Tasmanian nationalism, patriotism, related to the geography. And therefore, it did not relate to the ties back to Britain, the ties of blood and race and culture and language. His nationalism related to the place, and in this case to Tasmania. And that's why Clark's ideas so much grow out of Tasmania, but in some ways they are embellished and developed with the European ideas, the continental European ideas that were developed in the unification of Italy. Now, Clark made several very, very interesting speeches at the time of Federation. He was a federalist, and an important one. As I say, he drafted his own constitution, which was the foundation on which the Australian Constitution was based. But in a federal conference in 1890, he laid down what he thought was the reason why Australia should become united. And he says it was important that the population had to be localized, but that population to be a nation must be localized. That is, your patriotism had nothing to do with Britain. It had to be localized. He went on, it must be located within certain physical limits and must be responsive to the influences of its physical environment. I believe that it is to such conditions that we owe all the nationalities of the existing world. So Australians had a unique and important mission to develop a nationalism that related to Australia and to the distinctive nature of Australian geography. And this is what made him very, very different from all the other important men of that generation, the founding fathers. Because Clark was not a lover of Britain. He was a Republican. He was the only Republican amongst all of those important, significant Australian political figures, Parkes and Deakin and Kingston and Griffith. All of these men were loyalists. They were Anglo-Australians. They certainly were not Republicans. So Clark from Tasmania was the one who had adopted quite a different idea of Australian patriotism that had to relate to place, that empire itself would inhibit, ties with Britain would inhibit the growth of Australian nationalism based on geography. And thence in another speech at the time, he remarked, hence it follows that the distinctive characteristics exhibited by many of the nations of the world have been created by the influences of geographical location and general physical environment upon numerous generations of progenitors. And so Clark, in a way, became very disappointed by the Constitution, and above all by the legal arrangements, because Clark was passionately committed to the idea that the High Court of Australia would be the final court of appeal, because only then could Australians develop their own law, their own jurisprudence. But when they took the Constitution to Britain, it was the British were determined, indeed, that the final court of appeal would be the Privy Council in England, that Australia would not gain its jurisprudential independence. And Clark by then was on the Supreme Court of Tasmania, and wrote a long, extremely angry and passionate letter to the Sydney Morning Herald, bemoaning the fact that the Australian delegates in London had given way and that Australia would not be able to develop its own distinctive jurisprudence without the influence of Britain. Now, that idea, of course, took a long, long time to eventuate. His Republican ideas have yet to be brought to fruition. And the idea of breaking the jurisprudential ties with England didn't happen until the Australia Act in 1986. So you see, Clark was a very interesting and very distinctive figure. And in some ways, it's probably his republicanism which made him stand out. And that republicanism, coming partly from the ideas of the Italian Mazzini, also grew out of that Tasmanian experience we've just been talking about. The early development of a Tasmanian patriotism, the ideas of the young native born, of 1832 that they belonged to the land and thought nothing of England and couldn't bear the idea of going there. 20 years later, the young native-born Tasmanians who stood up and demanded the end of transportation and linked their own feelings about the political development of Tasmania with the freedom they felt on the mountaintops with the bracing Tasmanian air. These are the young people that would have been the mentors of Clark as he was growing up in Hobart. But he obviously, he's a cosmopolitan. He has a great interest in America and Italy. But these all come together to make him, as I say, the sole Republican amongst the founders of Federation. And I think that is because he grew up in Tasmania, and he grew up where patriotism and place had become very, very important. It had become a central idea in Tasmanian life. So that brings my story to an end. That is Clark and his republicanism is my third act. My first, you'll recall, was about the young native-born people that the boys were so impressed by. My act 2 was the young Tasmanians who demanded the end of transportation. My act 3 is the local Tasmanian-born Andrew Inglis Clark, who was the sole Republican amongst the founders of Federation. So thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you, Professor Reynolds, for your for that address. We very much appreciate your time and your wisdom in sharing these reflections and thoughts on this topic. Professor Reynolds will now answer some questions that participants in this webinar have submitted during the course of the lecture. I'm just opening those up as we speak. And the first one is, could you comment on the relationship to class, to Tasmania versus British identity? Those who sent their children to Britain to be educated, those who continued to import British academics, headmasters, bishops, until you yourself became one of the first generation of native-born academics. Class in the sense of educated classes, as well as proletarian versus aspiring patricians.
Yes, that's an interesting question. Let me say that there's no doubt that one of the difficulties that upper class Tasmanians, if we can use that, and this is true with certainly New South Wales, was that there was a very, very strong democratic spirit and egalitarianism, a rejection of ideas of hierarchy and ideas of deference, above all deference. Now, this was inevitable in a convict colony. That is, with the convicts, you could make them obey you, you could force them, you could use force them to make them to be obedient, but you couldn't make them be deferential. And the very convict experience had broken all those ties of deference which still existed in Britain. And so that you find that so many of the reasons the convicts got into trouble with the law, with their masters and mistresses, was they were so cheeky. They were so cheeky and rude and lacked deference, impudent, impertinent. They are the sort of words that are used. And I think this is an indication of the way the society was inevitably developing. Now, for people at the top of the social pyramid, they would have liked to have had the same sort of deference that they would have expected in England, perhaps not in the new industrial towns, but certainly in the great rural hinterland of Great Britain, certainly not in Ireland, obviously. But This problem of how do you distinguish yourself in a new world, and many of them therefore did look to Britain, because Britain in a way was the place where the right sort of attitudes could be found, and people looked to Britain in this sense. And as many people will know, they deliberately had their voices trained, the children's voices, did elocution so they could speak in a correct English way, rather than what had already developed by the middle of the 19th century was clearly an accent. And it was seen as being colonial and rough and not very desirable. So this tug between deference to Britain and desire to have a new society, that runs right through the history of Australia. And there's no doubt that in a sense, the idea of the independence that Clark wanted became more difficult as he was maturing and as his middle age and his political and legal career, because when he was growing up, the idea in Britain was that the colonies would inevitably become independent. That was the expectation, because that's what had happened in the United States. It had happened all over Latin America. Something like 30 new nation states had been created from the empires in the Americas up to 1830. And that was seen as an inevitable development. But by 1880, at least, that view had changed dramatically. So we had the new imperialism. We had Britain being threatened and challenged by the United States and the new United Germany. And Britain increasingly turned its attention to the empire and wanted to maintain the ties to the settler colonies. And Britain had an enormous amount of soft power. So the ideas that Clark had a battle by the end of the 19th century, and most of his fellow colonial politicians were very happy to receive knighthoods, although some didn't. I mean, Deakin and Kingston refused knighthoods, but most of them accepted very minor knighthoods, and they felt a continued link with Britain. And that view, of course, became much more pronounced, particularly in the early 20th century, with the rise of Japan. And so Clark's ideas, growing out of the Tasmanian experience, were still struggling, but continued there. And there's no doubt that they continued there in the attitude to landscape, to country, and to the sense of belonging to Tasmania. Even monarchists still felt a tremendous bond to Tasmania, and that has continued right through to the present. And there's no doubt that people still talk about their absolute commitment and love of Tasmania, but it's Tasmania as a place. It's not Tasmania as a society. And that's a separation that goes right back to the convict era. You couldn't love the society in Tasmania. You couldn't admire the social and political achievements of Tasmania nearly as much as you could admire the country, the landscape. But yes, of course, there was that long tradition of upper class Tasmanians wanting to be British and talking about going home, as they still did when Margaret and I first went to England. The older people, particularly the older ladies, my mother's friends, all said, "Oh, you're going home," which by then was a very strange idea, but it was still around.
Very interesting. Another question: how have and will do you think Tasmanians' notions of place incorporate Aboriginal perspectives and history?
Well, of course, it played very little part in the development of this Tasmanian patriotism, but for all sorts of reasons, which have been written about in many places. But undoubtedly, there is a move widely in Australia to join Australians' sense of belonging with the infinitely much older and longer sense that the First Nations had of belonging. Now, this is true in Tasmania, but in Tasmania's situation, we know comparatively little about the attitude of the Tasmanian First Nations. And it wasn't one people, it wasn't one race, it was 9 separate, distinct nations, and they may well have had quite different views. You can't assume cultural conformity. These people had maintained their cultural and political independence for 300 generations. It was important to them. And we can't assume that ideas that were first studied in North Australia in the early 20th century apply to Tasmania. But undoubtedly, behind the life of modern Tasmania is this extraordinary story of the First Nations who occupied Tasmania for incredibly long time and who were separated from the rest of the world for perhaps 300, 350 generations. It is an astonishing story, but it wasn't one that had much influence on the way the Tasmanians developed their ideas. But, it's also true to say that Tasmania had a much wider understanding of the history from even the 1830s with Henry Melville, John West in 1852, Bonwick in the 1870s, Calder in the 1870s, 1880s. There is this huge literature about the relations between the Tasmanian First Nations and the settlers. But there isn't that much sense that these two fused at the time. As I say, the idea of the picturesque, the romantic view of landscape was brought from Britain. And some way or another, the young native-born people simply came to see where they were born as their homeland, as well they might. So I think it's a work to be done, not one that was achieved in the 19th century.
Yes, indeed. One last question we have to entertain your mind today. Do you think the attitude of native-born Tasmanians to Britain was reflected in any way in their attitudes to the mainland colonies, for example, New South Wales, Victoria, and so on?
Well, in the early period, which I've looked at most closely myself, it was to New South Wales. I mean, South Australia and Western Australia were very, very new colonies, even in the 1850s. Up to 1850, Tasmania was undoubtedly the second most important colony economically, almost in population, but gradually being overtaken. But it was a thoroughly well-developed society. I mean, it had all the heritage, architectural heritage from the convict era, and it had institutions, and it had the Royal Society. It was, as I say, it was a more developed, sophisticated society than either of the smaller, newer colonies, but not New South Wales. They were very, very aware of their relationship with New South Wales. And by the 1820s, the newspapers started talking about how superior our island was to New South Wales. We had a better climate. It far suited the British Constitution. We'd be far more vigorous than those people living in a semi-tropical Langua. We could grow wheat and they couldn't. So there were, a lot of the patriotism indeed was directed not just back to England, but it was directed to New South Wales. They felt a pride and they felt that they were superior to the larger colony, a larger and older colony. So yes, they did think a lot about, particularly New South Wales. They obviously knew about South Australia and Western Australia, but not that much contact. And they, particularly Western Australia, remained a very, very small place. It only had 4,000 people in 1850. But they were coming to sort of think of themselves as part of the Australian world, and they had, you know, constant links with New South Wales, and then from the 1830s, of course, constant contact with Melbourne. As we know, you know, Launceston in particular, there was constant shipping contact across Bass Strait. In fact, so much of the early settlement in the southern part of Victoria and into the western districts came from Tasmania. So there was that awareness of continental Australia. But nonetheless, you still find throughout the period I've been talking about, people talking about, particularly if they've been away, and almost like the poem of Sir William Scott, they were so delighted to be back and feel the Tasmanian air and see the mountains. People who had grown up in Tasmania continued to feel that it was their homeland, even though they, in many cases, of course, had moved away. As it continues to be the case.
These cultural differences between Tasmania and everywhere else in the world are, I think, are not necessarily appreciated by those who come to live here initially, and it takes a while before they do work it out, really.
Yes, well, there are quite distinctive things. Now, one is that it was preeminently the convict colony. So in 1847, when the census was taken, 50% of the population were convicts or ex-convicts, 50%. 25% were the children. Probably 20% of those were the children with at least one convict parent. So by that time, the percentage of people with convict descent in New South Wales is about 10%. It is a profound difference, because New South Wales, the old convict element was completely swamped by rapid in-migration, particularly in the 1850s. And Tasmania didn't gain people, it lost people. So the old original pre-1850s population remained. And you know, some estimates are that 70% of Tasmanians are descended from, been in Tasmania for 7, 8, 9, 10 generations. Now, that's not a long time in many places, but it's a long time in Australia and a long time in many other settler colonies. And it also, of course, meant that there's a tremendous, as everyone will know, a tremendous network of friends and relatives that goes back generations. And so Tasmanians are incredibly linked socially to their society, as you all know from innumerable conversations where people who don't know one another, if they're old Tasmanians, within a very short space of time, it is most unlikely they haven't found connections, either mutual friends, or that they know where each other came from, they possibly went to the same schools, they find that they have other connections, they might even find they have distant relatives. And that too is unusual in a migrant society, because within the sort of in-migration you got in most of the mainland, those sort of intimate links got overtaken, and you didn't have that. And this is particularly so in parts of Australia. I mean, living in North Queensland, in those northern cities that have an incredibly moving population, 1/3 of the population moves within a few years. No one had any relatives, unless, you know, parents or aunties and uncles would come up for a visit during the dry season. But that is so different in Tasmania. And it's one of the things, I think, which makes Tasmanians feel at home, because they have been at home for a long time.
A remarkable sense of continuity amidst the changing world. Quite unique, really, in our quarter of the world, I guess.
Well, it's unique, as I say, in modern societies that continually have inflow of new people. And that's particularly true of the mainland and the mainland cities, where it just didn't happen in Tasmania. We had very little migration. Our great period of migration was during the convict years. And we had little migration in the 19th. We began to get migrants in the 1880s with the mining boom, but then that all changed in the depression of the 90s. Very little migration between the wars, and limited migration compared to the mainland after the Second World War. And growing up in West Hobart, everyone that I went to school with, in, you know, a large state school, everyone, I think, was Tasmanian born, with you know, with British, Anglo, Irish, Scottish, Welsh forebears. There was no one who was different that I can think of looking back. And I suspect a great many of them would have had convict ancestors, because Tasmanians have only recently, well, in the last generation, have come to rediscover their convict heritage, because it was a matter of embarrassment and shame for generations.
We could talk all day about this. It's fascinating, and a fascinating subject close to Tasmanians' hearts. And those who are viewing this webinar from overseas who know this land well. Professor Reynolds, thank you very much for this really fascinating address, taking us along the route of looking at Tasmanian society through the lens of our land and how we've progressed over all those years. Thank you very much on behalf of the Northern Branch of the Royal Society of Tasmania. We very much appreciate that.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
In thanking Professor Reynolds, to where we go next. Where we go next is 2021. And that marks the centenary of the Northern Branch of the Royal Society's continuous operation here in Launceston, Tasmania. And we have a number of things planned to honour this. The 2021 Launceston Lecture Series will start with Dr. Jennifer Lavers in February, and she'll be presenting her lecture entitled Impacts of Plastics on Marine Wildlife. And it's our intention to meet again at the Inverness campus of the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery for this, and COVID-19 allowing. And we will provide a Zoom connection to the lecture presentation, so those who are unable to attend in person can enjoy the lecture from the comfort of home. due to COVID-19 safety precautions, they won't be afternoon tea following these early lectures at the moment. Then in March, Dr. Katie Flanagan will bring us up to date on global and Australian perspectives for COVID-19 vaccine rollout. You may know she's been involved in the Australian end of vaccine development there. The full program of our 2021 lecture series will be found on our website, which the URL is on the screen there in the big bright yellow letters on the bottom left of the screen.